Oh, thank you very much. Thanks everybody for coming to our workshop, and I didn't sleep very well last night, so but things should be, hopefully things will work out okay. But I think the reason I didn't sleep so well is because I knew I had to leave Edinburgh tomorrow, and that makes me sad, crying. It's been such a great trip, and just really loved being here, and I also I just loved Scotland in general. It's so great. And so anyway, here we are talking about grounding. I'm going to be looking at what I take to be two of the best, not the only, but two of the best arguments that I've seen for capital G grounding. Where capital G grounding, as we've been discussing, is I'm going to also be thinking of it as a relation that would serve to hopefully make sense or ground explanations. But key to my understanding of capital G grounding is that it's a broadly primitive notion, and it's supposed to be different from the other sorts of metaphysical dependence relations, the ones I call the small g grounding relations, that in my view have been typically at issue in these contexts where issues of metaphysical dependence are at issue. And just to clarify a little bit, following on Anna Sophia's interesting talk, there are these metaphysical dependence relations, a great variety of them, some involving what you might call full constitutive dependence or full grounding, and then others which are kind of partial grounding-y. I would not include supervenience, for example, among the small g grounding relations. The small g grounding relations I had in mind in the first instance were ones that would indicate some kind of fully constitutive relation between the grounded and the grounding entities. So identity being a paradigm case, but I also think there's a bunch of other cases, and Jonas mentioned one of them, functional realization. I think that's a case properly understood. The determinable determinate relation might be another case. Part-whole relation might be such a case, or whole part, depending on the direction of priority, which is something I'll be talking about in a minute. I think if we're looking at all the different contexts where the idioms of metaphysical dependence have been at issue, we metaphysicians, not just recently, but from time immemorial, have been focusing on these questions of broadly synchronic constitutive dependence, right? Since before Aristotle and so on and so forth. So then the question is, if we already have the small g grounding relations, which are, unlike supervenience, not sufficient unto the task of making sense of what it would be for some goings-on to be nothing over and above some others, or causation, again, not being, at least in the broadly synchronic case, compatible with the over and aboveness, the non-in-virtue-ness of the higher level relata, or relatum, then why should we posit, go on and furthermore posit a broadly primitive notion? And so what, part of my project in No Work for a Theory of Grounding was just first to highlight that these small g grounding relations are available. They're off-the-shelf resources that we in fact use all the time, and they do serve as, I think, closing the explanatory question in a way that supervenience doesn't, in a way that causation would not be suited for under the circumstances. So the question is, why moreover posit big G grounding, this broadly primitive notion, which is supposed to be modulo concerns about identity or whatever, at issue across all these different contexts where metaphysical dependence is at issue. And the priority argument for grounding, roughly speaking, is one that is directed against my preferred understanding of what it is to give a metaphysical explanation, so to speak. And I'll say more about that in a second. And the unity argument for grounding is one that Jonathan Schaffer sort of mentioned at the end of his paper on what grounds what, where he suggested that even if there were, these small g grounding relations available, still, capital G grounding might serve as a kind of unifier of those relations. And he gestured at these formal features, the partial ordering, which I am now, thanks to Anna Sophia's talk, they just reflect like conflating the the question of like, oh yeah, we want a metaphysical explanation which supervenience and causation can't give us, and then taking the talk of explanation too seriously, when what we're really looking for is just a metaphysical account, right? A metaphysical story that closes the question, why are there chairs? Why should we appeal to concrete possible worlds, as a way of making sense of modal talk, and so on and so forth. But, given that partial orders are kind of a dime a dozen, and also given all the various counterexamples to various features of partial ordering, Jonathan Schaffer came up with a more robust unity argument for grounding, which appeals to basically an analogy to causation, with the idea being that just as the diverse variety of causal relations, baking and shaking and making and all that good stuff, could be subsumed, unified under a single formalism, in particular the structural equation modeling formalism, so too can the diverse small g grounding relations be subsumed under actually the same formalism. And so this, he wants to say, gives us reason to posit grounding. And Alistair has a different but related project, as we just saw earlier, which is actually, I think, interestingly tied to Aristotle's four causes, where one of the causes is material causation actually might be similar to metaphysical explanation. So I think the idea that there's this species that covers both causation and metaphysical explanation or grounding actually is really interesting, and maybe there's something to that. But I'll talk a little bit about Alistair's the analogies between supposed analogies between what broadly physical or nomological causation and metaphysical causation when I get to that side of the board. Okay, priority argument for grounding. I claim that we have all these small g relations, token type identity, determinable determinant, functional realization, my own preferred proper subset of powers for the case of special science entities and the like. Part whole, for example, that do this work of grounding, so we don't, so the question is, why do we need capital G grounding? Here's one reason you might say, the small g relations on their own don't do the work of establishing the direction of priority. So consider, for example, if you're an atomist, then you're going to think that the parts ground the whole. But if you're a monist, like Jonathan Schaffer, you will think that the whole grounds the part. So part whole, for example, classical mereological part whole, doesn't itself wear the direction of priority on its sleeve, right? So in the first instance, the idea is that the small g, don't suffice to determine priority. Big G grounding is needed. And this was an objection that Kit Vine raised in conversation, and Alex Jackson and Jonathan Schaffer also. So what's my response? My response is to say that, basically I agree that the small g relations in general don't themselves establish the direction of priority. That might be not true for some relations, like I think set membership, for example. Maybe set membership always, is such that the members ground the set and so on. However, part whole and a bunch of other relations, maybe you would think that's true. So in those cases, what I claim, yes, more is needed, but it's not capital G grounding. What it is specification of what is fundamental. Okay, now that's the first pass. We're going to fill this in. But the idea is that, think about, metaphysical methodology, right? So Schaffer says, okay, the whole is fundamental. And now he's going to tell you about how everything else fits into that. And then the parts are going to be non-fundamental if the whole is fundamental. Contrary-wise, if the parts are fundamental, then fusions of the parts are going to be non-fundamental. So specifying the fundamental along with the small g relations will fix the direction of priority. So I'll just say fundamental fixes the direction of small g relations. Well, one thing you might then immediately respond to me, as my horrible husband did, is, well, maybe you need capital G grounding after all. Why? Because how should you understand the fundamental? And now, following on Stefan's talk, one way to understand the fundamental is as the ungrounded, right? So if you want to understand, so you still need grounding since the fundamental is the ungrounded. But the grounded here can't be one of the small g grounding relations because I've just said that you need the fundamental to make sense of the direction of priority of the small g grounding relation. So here, this grounded has to be understood as a primitive or something like that. So my response there is don't understand the fundamental that way. Why not? Because, well, first of all, it's a negative specification of the fundamental, but and some people don't like negative goings on. But the real problem is that it's a non-basic specification of the fundamental. So it's a first problem is that it's a negative, and more importantly, non-basic characterization of what is ... fundamental, right? And should not be characterized in other terms. The fundamental, to me, is kind of like axioms, right, in the theory of the world, so to speak. And axioms are basic and appropriately taken to be primitive. So my understanding of the fundamental here is going to end up being one that is primitive. It's not specified in these other terms, these relational terms. So here I actually follow Kit Fine, who agrees with me about that. And then the other thing is that if you understand the fundamental as the ungrounded, then you're, you're assuming, you're assuming some controversial metaphysics, right? So you're ruling out, for example, self-grounding entities or entities that, fundamental entities that ground each other. So this was something I was concerned about with respect to this from below conception of fundamentality that Stefan was discussing. Okay. So that's what I say there. Now the notion of fundamental here too is going to be hyper-intentional. So one thing, let's just be clear, both me and the capital G grounding person have a primitive hyper-intentional notion in our theories. I have primitive hyper-intentional fundamentality and then all these small g relations which we already know and love, so those are just off-the-shelf resources, whereas the capital G grounding person has a primitive relation, right, between entities, and then maybe they can define the fundamental in terms of that primitive relation. So we both have some stuff that everyone accepts, and then we each have a primitive hyper-intentional notion. Okay. So we're even on that score. Now, what about, though, you might say, what about non-fundamental entities? You've told me how, if some entities are grounded in some fundamental goings on, how the direction of priority gets fixed for a small g relation. But what about, like, my hand and my body, right? So both my hand and my body, let's say on an atomist view, are non-fundamental, but which is prior to which? It depends, right? If I'm a perduratist, for example, I might think that hands and bodies are both classical mereological fusions of the atoms, and so which is prior to which. Whereas if I'm like a Aristotelian kind of person, I might think that hands and bodies, I'm still an atomist, I think the atoms are fundamental, but I think that hands and bodies are functionally characterized non-fundamental entities, okay? So far I haven't told you how that story is supposed to go, so the question is, well, what about, let's call it relative fundamentality or priority, right? And here my story is, it depends on the first part of my story. It says, look, you know, just like I was just telling you, you're going to have to, in order to determine like which is prior to which between non-fundamenta, assuming there is a direction of priority there, first thing you have to do is get an account of what those entities are in terms of the more fundamental guys, okay? So, you know, as I just told you. So, but I claim once you have those accounts in hand, that's going to indicate what the direction of priority is, if there is one. So, for example, if I'm a fusion person, a perdurantist sort of person, you know, I question hand prior to body. I don't know, maybe not. Actually, a person, they might just say, look, they're both fusions, but neither is really prior to the other. Maybe they could say something like smaller fusions are more fundamental than bigger fusions. And that strikes me as implausible, but you know, it's something they could say, right? But note that in order for them to say that, they didn't have to build a capital G grounding. Now, similarly, for the Aristotelian, they say, okay, we've got two functional specifications here. In this case, it looks like the order of priority is probably going to be reversed, right? So a hand can't exist, right, without the body existing, although the body could exist without the hand existing. That's just a test, right? But in this case, it tells you that if there's a direction of priority here, the body is prior to the hand. So again, that's how we've got to do it, right? That's looking at the methodology of metaphysics. That's what we do, and that's good enough to give us a direction of priority in these cases. And notice that I didn't have to appeal to capital G grounding. So the answer here is just, you know, look at the accounts of the non-fundamenta in terms of the fundamenta. And that's going to give you your direction, if there is one. Okay. Now we come to Schaffer's latest iteration of this little dialectic. Okay, so Schaffer says, okay, let's go back to the first part. What if there's no fundamental level? Then he says, you're now going to not be able to talk about any of the priority relations that are, you know, operative, right? Because of the small g relations require the specification of the fundamental in order to fix the direction of priority and to get my little story there off the ground. But let's say it's a gunky world, then you know, how do you get any directions of priority? Again, there might be some small g relations like set membership, which somehow give you a like automatic direction of priority without specification of the fundamental, but in general there'd be some problems there. So here my response is kind of two-part. So you can say, let's see how I want to do this. Okay, so no fundamental level. So here's the question. Is it, sorry, so possibly no fundamental level? Okay, one thing I could say is no, that's not possible. Another thing I could say is that yes, it is possible. Okay, so why say, if I want to, that it's not in fact possible that there be a fundamental level, not be a fundamental level, say for, you know, the broadly scientific entities, which are my concern? Well, one reason is that, you know, you can't really make sense of the idea of there being a ground for this substantial stuff if everything is just continually depending on something else. This is a variation on, I think it's Ned Block's argument that, you know, do causal powers drain away? You know, there's just some concern that, you know, you can't get priority off the ground if there's no no fundamental level, right? That's something you could say. Another thing you could say is that this kind of appeals to my own way of understanding like the relative priority relations in the case of the special sciences vis-a-vis more fundamental sciences, right? So I have this proper subset view, and the idea is that, you know, as things get smaller and smaller, more fine-grained, again, assuming something like atomism, things become more specific, right? Finer grained, and associated with that is like more powers, right? If you're finer grained, you have more powers. This is controversial, but you know, this is my view. And a lot of people actually, I think, accept this view either directly or indirectly. They think that as you get, you know, move to the micro level, things get more and more specific. But if there's no fundamental level, that means that things can get infinitely specific or have infinitely many powers. And that just strikes me as, you know, something that could be denied. So it would entail infinite specificity and infinite powers. You know, just thinking about things, oh yeah, they just keep breaking up. But thinking about like the metaphysical / scientific connotations of what that would mean, I think, kind of suggests that that would be implausible. On the other hand, suppose I do want to grant that there is, it's possible that there's no fundamental level. Well, two things I could say there. Maybe there's some kind of convergence. You know, now how exactly to work this out, I don't know. But you know, in mathematics, you can have an infinite sequence, but it can converge on some number. And so maybe, in this case, you could also have something like an infinite convergence onto what would be effectively a fundamental level. You've got to work out the details there, but you know, the idea is that there's an analogy to convergence in the mathematical case. Or you could say, at some point, the archaeology of the fundamental, or whatever, the archaeology of everything below a certain level stops. It just doesn't matter, right? So long as a given level, and this is kind of a move that Barbara Montero makes when she's considering whether there's no fundamental level. The idea is that, like, it's supposed to fit the physical level is not, in fact, the most fundamental level. Does that spell a big problem for physicalism? Well, not really, so long as the physical level kind of, you know, like goings on below the physical level don't really matter for purposes of making sense of the grounding of things that are above that level. So, you know, maybe the idea is that you get something that looks like a relatively fundamental level. So, anyway, that's the next step in this iteration where I'm trying to motivate my preferred way of thinking about metaphysical dependence and trying to defend it against some objections. So now turning to the unity argument, I'm going to focus primarily on Jonathan's paper since that was my initial target in these debates that we've been having with each other. So what I want to do is throw up his unity argument for capital G grounding, and then it's got three premises. I'm going to argue against each premise, but along the way I'm going to kind of intersperse some discussion of Al's, you know, comments, interesting comments about like analogies between metaphysical and nomological causation. But here's Jonathan's argument. So the first premise is that, you know, if some phenomena are formally unified, this provides reason to posit a unifier. And by the way, just to clarify here, with this notion of unification, there's a way of thinking about like a lightweight form of unification which just says, oh, we've got some kind of unified concept. Like I can, you know, start off in my investigations into physicalism by just saying, oh, physicalism is the thesis that all the broadly scientific goings-on are nothing over and above the physical goings-on. Where the nothing over and above there is kind of, in my view, is kind of a schematic placeholder. But you know, if you want to say, oh, we've got some kind of general concept of capital G grounding, you know, I guess I'm willing to accept that, but it's, you know, again, I'm going to give it a deflationary reading when it comes to the metaphysical, right, referent of that seemingly general concept, and this is something that will play a little bit more role down the line. But I just want to say that just because, you know, I can use the word capital G ground, nothing over and above in a kind of neutral way over the small g, ranging over small g grounding relations, it doesn't immediately follow that there's a general posit there. So I distinguish, not everyone does, but I distinguish between representation and reality, and that there might be some general representations. Doesn't, to my mind, it doesn't follow immediately that there's a general metaphysical posit answering to that general concept. Okay, so if some phenomena are formally unified, this provides reason to posit a unifier. Again, it may not be decisive, but you know, under the circumstances. Second premise, the diverse causal relations are aptly formally unified by structural equation modeling, okay? The sort that Alistar was talking about earlier. And third is that the small g grounding relations are also aptly formally unified by structural equation modeling formalism. And more generally, the idea is that they are, small g grounding relations are analogous to causal relations, and actually, what do I want to say here? No, that's correct, okay. But you know, the idea is that in the first instance is that the small g grounding relations are analogous to the small c causal relations, and so are appropriately seen as aptly formally unified by the structural equation modeling formalism. So we conclude that the small g relations are unified, and so there's reason to posit grounding. I guess I should say formally unified, right? Okay, so that's the argument. Well, so against premise one, I just want to start off by saying that just because some phenomena are formally unified, that in itself doesn't give you a reason to posit unifier. Okay, so consider a case in point. Many people think that, well, put it this way, determinables, right, should they exist independent of irreducible to determinants, would unify all the determinants, and they would do so formally because there's a formalism associated with the determinable determinant relation, and they would unify them not just formally but also metaphysically and terminologically, right? So determinables, you might think, should be posited as formally unifying determinants. But this isn't my view, but by far the most common view of determinables is that they're reducible to determinants. Either, schematic, the idea is that reference to determinables is always schematic reference to determinants, that's what John Hall thinks, or that determinables, metaphysically speaking, are identical with a disjunction of the determinants, so that's Armstrong and a bunch of other people. So, premise one, on the face of it, it seems like more is needed. Because, it depends how much reason to posit a unifier is there. Maybe there's a little bit of reason, but it's still worth noting that not just with the case of determinables and determinants, but also special science entities. So think about the fact that, if special science entities existed, they would unify formally and otherwise diverse lower level physical goings on. But again, it's very common to give special science entities some kind of deflationary or reductive treatment. Again, that's not my preferred view, but I'm just saying that unification is not itself, it seems like, out there in the philosophical world of philosophical methodology, is not usually taken to be sufficient motivation or even very good motivation for positing a unifier. And, you know, why is that? Well, I mean, the obvious thing to say is parsimony considerations, right? This is actually following up a little bit on what Jesper was saying. You know, it's like, look, if we don't have to posit something different, but we can still explain this phenomena, you know, well, we try to do it. We try to give a reductive account for parsimony reasons. So if you want to maintain that, so the question is, like, what more is needed, right, just beside the bare formal or other unification in order to motivate positing a general, you know, correlate, general unifier of some phenomena? Well, looking at my own work, I would say with respect to special sciences, what I do is I try to argue that the special sciences are, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to say what I, you know, the kind of upshot. I could talk more about this, like eliminations in degrees of freedom, reductions in powers, blah, blah, blah. But the basic idea is that special science entities are characterized in a distinctively unspecific way. That's what it, you know, this is what the special science laws treat them as, you know, information, put it this way, information gets lost, removed when you move to higher levels of natural reality and the special sciences and so on and so forth. And as a result, this prevents their reduction. It prevents a deflationary or reductive treatment because, you know, this guy has reduced information. You can't take that guy and put him down and have the fundamental physical laws operate on him anymore. Why? Because the physical laws require all that information, like the location of every specific particle and its momentum and its spin and stuff like that. But that information got lost when I characterized the special science entity. So anyway, that's a story, rough sketch of how it is that I try to motivate positing special science entities, you know, as doing these other things. You know, they are unifying and other good stuff too. But the idea is that you have to provide a non-pragmatic reason for thinking that those entities, that the unifier is characterized just by the commonalities, between the things that it unifies, right? And I run a similar line for determinables as well. But it doesn't seem as if the structural, so you know, that's what more is needed. But suffice to say, so far Jonathan hasn't provided that. And I don't think that appeal to the structural equation modeling is going to do that work necessarily, because, you know, what that does, that formalism does is, you know, you feed in whatever and it spits out some relation, but it doesn't guarantee that the grounded entities are less specific, you know, in the distinctive way that special science entities are less specific. So, and I think on the contrary, you know, it just, that formalism keeps in the specificity that's associated with, you know, its grounding input, so to speak. It's something I'll return to in a second. Okay, so that's premise one. What about premise two? Diverse causal relations are aptly formally unified. Well, as Alistair was discussing, Ned Hall and a bunch of other people have pointed out that, you know, there's a diversity, not just of baking, shaking, and making. This is kind of what Jonathan says, but different, like what we might say, forms of causation or types of causation, which are quite distinctive and seem to be incompatible in certain respects, right? So these production accounts that are associated with transference or manifestation of dispositions, or even like Humean regularity theory, and so on. Those are all the production-y accounts. And then on the other hand, you have these counterfactual dependency accounts. And so on the face of it, the diverse causal relations are not themselves aptly formally, you know, formally unified by SEM. Some of them are, and one thing I really appreciate about Alistair's paper is that, you know, he's, you know, you observe this, you observe this fact, and you're like, look, what I'm saying is that, you know, metaphysical causation is, you know, a form of, well, it's analogous to physical causation of the counterfactual dependence or interventionist variety. Okay. And here I'll just interject a little commentary with respect to this question of theoretical motivations for thinking that grounding is metaphysical causation. One of them was that you were going to reduce the number of kind of commitments, right? So the idea is that you just got the single generic causal relation, which includes both physical causation and grounding. But if it's true that what's really going on, the thing that's unified there is like counterfactual dependency causation and grounding, then there's still this other variety of causation which isn't clearly subsumable under the genus that had both of those two guys. So it's not clear that we made it in advance. Before we had production and counterfactual dependence under one genus, and then metaphysical over thing, and then you basically switched out. Okay. So that's about all I had to say about the second premise. So now what about the third premise? This is where all the, I think, a lot of interesting action is. Here also I want to discuss just a little bit more before I get into the details of my specific argument against Schaffer. Alistair offers, I think, some really interesting suggestions by way of trying to say that like grounding relations are analogous to causal relations. So I just wanted to very briefly, how much time do I have, by the way?
Another 10
minutes or so? Okay, fine. Okay, so here's some argument, reasons that you gave for thinking that there was, grounding equals metaphysical causation, right? So there was the parsimony consideration, the theoretical one, so I just, offered a concern about that, right? So, not really. The second one is that, well, this is kind of a disanalogy, so this is not something that you discussed, but I think that if you try to subsume these things, you lose, there's a theoretical cost in that, the primary distinction between physical causation and grounding, any form is that the former is, compatible with what I'm going to just call over, over and aboveness. Latter isn't. Okay, so like the main, well, even the proponents of capital G grounding were coming out and say, oh, well, we need grounding. Why? Because causation doesn't get you the kind of distinctive nothing over and aboveness that's at issue where these idioms of metaphysical dependence are at issue, right? And then, so this is an important distinction between causation and grounding is that, grounding preserves, in some sense, the it's like a constitutive relation, whereas physical causation is not. It's like a kind of robustly productive relation of some sort. Now, Alistair offers, a way of trying to make sense of this distinction, which appeals to either contingency versus necessity, or also like causation is diachronic, and metaphysical.
I actually like the diachronic argument. Yeah. I want to put all the weight on the contingent.
Okay, good. And you can say that, but then the concern is that since some people think that the causal relations are in fact metaphysically necessary in the sense that were the circumstances to occur, then that would be metaphysically necessitated and stuff like that. But suffice to say, there's just this kind of concern that your account depends on controversial metaphysics. Another one is, let's see. That your account requires, non-trivial acceptance of non-trivial counterpossible counterfactuals. It's a cost. Maybe not a huge cost, but a cost. Another one is this concerns when an analogy that you identify that they both kind of face the same problems. They face these apparent counterexamples and stuff like that. So they both face the same problems. challenges to their transitivity or whatever else. But what I want to say there is that, so why is it a virtue that they both have a bunch of problems? Like, how does that help? Get rid of them both. Let's see what else we got here. Okay, it's supposed to be partial orders. No, they're both. That's the claim. Both partial orders. Not. Oh yeah, and finally, the diagnosis you offer of why it is that people have been resistant to capital G grounding. I just want to say I don't think it's plausible because most people weren't thinking about counterpossibles as a necessary concomitant of acceptance of capital G grounding. So it's just not plausible. All right. So I'll just keep that down here. Okay, so there's a lot of disanalogies I want to say, like claims that there are, really analogies here are kind of certainly, one could call them into question. But what about this business about, in particular, that they're analogous in being both formally unified by structural equation modeling? So that's, you might think, look, this is going to win the day, and that's kind of where Schaffer places most of his weight. Here I just want to say, and this is interesting because it goes back to this question of the determinable and the determinant, right, where you have scarlet, and that's supposed to ground red. Okay, so again, on this usual understanding where determinables ground determinants. And then the idea was that, well, if we were to, change the scarlet variable, change a variable representing scarlet to navy, this is something that Schaffer does. Change scarlet to navy, and then what you end up with, if you set up your structural equations correctly, is that these are the dependent variables, these are independent variables. So if it's scarlet, then it gives you red, and if it's navy, it gives you blue. So this basic idea of counterfactual dependence gets in an interventionist framework. The idea is that you wiggle the grounded entities, then wiggle the grounding entities, and the grounded entities will wiggle. It's just similarly with the causal. You wiggle the cause, and the effect will wiggle. What I want to say is just, like, on the face of it, counterfactually, it's not the case that if scarlet hadn't, the shirt hadn't been scarlet, then it would have been navy. I think it would have been another shade of red. I mean, the closest possible worlds where the shirt's not red, scarlet, it's some other variation of red. And so wiggling the grounding entities, at least on just appealing straightforwardly to your standard accounts of counterfactuals, is not going to wiggle the determinable, right? So you don't get the counterfactual dependence. Now, what Schaffer says, and I assume Al will say something similar, is that you've got to have the right contrast class so that you set up your variables in such a way that you do get the wiggling over here will result in wiggling over there. But I just want to say that's cheating. It's not cheating, but again, it's not cheating, but what I take it to be doing is kind of we're not correctly modeling the determinable-determinant relation. So interesting thing about grounding relations, and I'm going to press this analogy in the remainder of the talk, is that they often will take more specific entities to less specific entities, right? But then in those cases, all those cases are going to be ones where, on the face of it, the idea is that this guy doesn't depend on the specific details of this guy. That's the whole point. That's the whole point when we go from the micro-physical specification up to a special science. We get rid of some of the details. They stop mattering, so the micro-physical stuff can change, but the macro stuff doesn't change. So that's the whole point of all these relations that are operative in the physicalism debates. If you're a non-reductive physicalist, functional realization is a case. this proper subset of powers is the case. The idea is that you go to the special science, you get rid of some of the detail, such that, change the microphysical stuff and the macro stuff just keeps soldiering on. This is the basis for example, the persistence of macroscopic entities through change, compositional flexibility and stuff. So I just feel like it's not, it's not a good model for it. I think that's the thing. It's not like you can't find some way of trying to make it, come out right, but it just seems like it's the wrong model. And just to kind of press this, although this again, there's I'm sure there's counter-possible response here, but suppose this was a world where it was just red was only determinable, right? Everything was some shade of red. We should be able to say that the determinants, scarlets and reds and crimsons and blah, 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 grounded the determinable without there having to be other determinable colors. It just seems like that's, that should have been the case, and maybe I'll beef up the illustration by saying, oh yeah, and I followed Jackson in thinking that, if you hadn't experienced a color, you can't even conceive of any other color. So it was sort of in that scenario, we're not in a position to imagine, right, this kind of contrast. So, we wouldn't be able to use the structural equation modeling to make sense of the grounding relation. Again, there might be bells and whistles. But just to sum up, just 1 or 2 more minutes, maybe, what's going on here seems like it's a case of, it's overdetermination of the sort that plagues counterfactual dependence accounts of causation. So here I think Alistair would say, yeah, there's a problem here, but look, they're analogous because they both face the same problem. Like the same kind of cases are going to overdetermination in a causal case, and here, like overdetermination with respect to grounding, like crimson is waving in the wings to ground red if scarlet goes away. But so they're analogous in these 2 different ways. But I want to suggest that actually the disanalogy runs deep because of this difference in grounding as opposed to causation, where grounding typically will take more specific goings-on to less specific goings-on. So you might say, no, that's okay because that's not special, that's not unique to grounding, because certainly we can talk about causal relations that take highly specific causes to very general effects, like maybe, my specifically throwing the baseball shatters. So whenever the shattering is understood as a general, a coarse-grained event, so to speak. But I think the disanalogy runs deep because in those cases, I can still use the structural equation modeling for the causal relation because I can just get more specific, right? So there, in those cases, that's a case where wiggling the cause might not. Well, there might be, I've got to give a different case there, but the idea is that, moving from cases where the causal relation moves from a more specific cause to a less specific effect can always be reconceived or kind of reconfigured or so on to involve 2 highly specific causes so that you do get wiggling over here, we'll get wiggling over here. But you cannot do that for the grounding relation because to try to reconceive of the determinable in more specific terms is to undermine the very relation that we're trying to model, right? That's the whole point of the grounding relation. It cannot be, or these kind of grounding relations, they can't be, you can't reconceive of the grounded entity as being specific. You can do that for causal relations or causal relata. You can't do it for grounding relata. So I think that I claim the disanalogy runs deep there. So that would be my reasons for thinking that, in fact, that those, I shouldn't be putting check marks. None of those premises go through. So the argument from unity so far does not succeed. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.